we're going into a couple of exposés. And this one was known variously as the Great Famine, Great Hunger, and the Irish Potato Famine. But whatever name it is known by, the humanitarian disaster of the mid-1800s changed forever the face of Ireland and its close neighbour Liverpool in the United Kingdom. And it all started when blight hit the Irish potato crop in 1845. And many of Ireland's poor depended wholly on the potato for food, and alongside a host of political, social and economic factors, hunger and malnutrition set in, which was then followed by disease and death. And in a 10-year span, up to 1 million people died in Ireland, and even more of them would emigrate. And it's estimated that during the fateful years of 1845 to 1852, about 1.3 million people from Ireland passed through the port of Liverpool. And local officials watched on in horror as thousands of destitute men, women and children, many of them described as half naked and starving, arrived each month. And a large number of them were en route to America, Canada or Australia, but many decided to put roots down in Liverpool. Now, as the closest major British port to Dublin and the gateway to the most industrialised region in the country, Liverpool was an obvious place for those fleeing the famine to go. And many already had connections in the region, and Liverpool also served as a staging post before the longer journey to North America. That was part of the white slavery program ran against the Irish. Yes, there was white slavery. And that involved the Jewish-owned slave ships, and in part, the Vatican. And those Jewish-owned slave ships largely came out of the Dutch East Indies Company, and so in essence was connected not only to the Rothschilds, but the French House of Orange, which later became synonymous with the Dutch. But remember, it was the Dutch House of Orange group led by King Billy that destroyed Ireland in the Battle of the Boyne, and yet curiously the Irish people still blame the British for that war. The Vatican Church was an instigator behind that war also. In fact, that church has done much against the Irish peoples, despite the dominant religion in that country being Catholic. And Irish history is almost as distorted as American history, it seems. Now, an 1851 census revealed that 22.29% of the Liverpool population was Irish-born, 84,000 out of a total population of 376,000. And in Birkenhead, across the river from Liverpool, where many of the migrants lived and worked, the proportion was even higher. And it has led to the ties between Liverpool and its nearest neighbour across the Irish Sea becoming famously close, to the extent of Liverpool being dubbed the second capital of Ireland. And everything from the accent to the unique character of the city's people has been attributed to its strong Irish connection, but the relationship hasn't always been a happy one. And the poverty-stricken Irish migrants who lived in appalling conditions in Liverpool's slums and also the poorest parts of the city were demonised for decades. And in Liverpool in 1847 there were 35,000 people, mainly Irish, living in cellars in the Vauxhall and Scotland Road areas, while some 5,341 inhabited cellars described as wells of stagnant water, and typhus, dysentery and cholera were rife. But it needs to be said that the conditions on the very opposite side of the road, Vauxhall and Scotland Road, and there was a divide, for Protestants were actually no better. And they're still not better 100 and odd years later. In Liverpool, just outside of the town, there was two main roads, the Scotland Road and the Vauxhall Road. And the Catholics lived on one side of the road, and the fake Catholics, Protestants, because they really are Catholic, there was no Protestant religion, lived on the other side of the road. And they fought and fought and fought and spat at each other, threw stones at each other, violence against people who made love pacts or got married, Protestant or a Catholic, separate. It was brutal, right up until the middle 60s, I would think. And it got better after that, but there's still pockets who to this day are still bitter between each other, the Protestants and the Catholics. If only they realised they're all the same. And also they realised they would be better off, both of them, of dropping the labels and just being people together. And so the conditions for the native peoples and those arriving as migrants were actually appalling for the all at the time. And this was despite it being one of the richest cities globally due to the docks and trading, which at that point in time was the most used docks the world over. But the city simply couldn't cope with the vast influx of Irish immigrants, and in June 1847, under the new Poor Law Removal Act, about 15,000 Irish were deported back to Ireland. Now, today there are few reminders of this humanitarian disaster and the influence it has had on the city, and there is an Irish famine memorial in the gardens of what is known as the bombed-out church, St. Luke's, in the town centre of Liverpool. And back in 1997, the Liverpool Irish Famine Trail was unveiled to mark the 150th anniversary of what is known as Black 1847, which was the worst year of the Great Famine. Now, although these plaques still survive, many people have now forgotten about the Heritage Trail or don't even know it exists. And they are written in both Gaelic and English and mark the most important sites in both Liverpool and Birkenhead associated with this major historical event. Now, one at Clarence Dock reads, "Through these dock gates passed most of the 1.3 million Irish migrants who fled the Great Famine and took the ship to Liverpool in the years 1845 to 1852. Another in Mulberry Street in the city's University District reads, "Near this place in 1847, some 2,600 destitute Irish famine migrants were buried in unmarked pauper graves. And they had died in extreme poverty in the parish of Liverpool, and so ending their flight from the great hunger." And meanwhile in Price Street near Hamilton Square in Birkenhead, a plaque of exactly the same design reads, "This area of Birkenhead provided shelter and employment to thousands of Irish migrants in the famine years 1845 through 52. And in 1851, a quarter of the town's population in Birkenhead was Irish-born, which was the highest proportion of any British town at that time." And this sounds to me of what went on at that time as a deliberate attempt by the authorities, and yes, it goes back that far and much further, to not only crush Ireland, but the city of Liverpool also. And the reason being, and is still going ongoing today is the fierce and determined traits of the people to fight injustice and an almost inbred sense of rebellion against those that attack or wrong us. And this was seen as a threat to the system, and decades of underfunding left both populations in poor economic conditions and has created a large, almost feral type of people in both regions. For those of you in the UK who don't think it's feral, go and read the Liverpool Echo News on a daily basis and tell me differently. But what they're trying to do now, and what they're hoping, is that the famine trail can now be regenerated after the annual Liverpool Irish Festival, which concludes last weekend, and announced it had secured initial funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund for the project. And Emma Smith, who's an artistic director and CEO of the Irish Festival, said, "The existing trail is an unrealised asset in Liverpool's cultural offer and a missing link in the search many Irish diaspora people undertake to trace their families." Now, the plaques were erected in the late 1990s, and since then city developments and global technologies have advanced at a pace. And the Liverpool Irish Festival is working with the remaining members of the Great Hunger Commemoration Committee on the revitalisation of the trail, marking the influence, impact, migration and loss of many Irish people here in Liverpool and across the world. And it's good stuff, but the point forgotten is the victimhood and woe is me people. The city of Liverpool was kind enough to try and house, feed and care for the desperate Irish at a time no one wanted them. And that is something that has largely been overlooked. And particularly in light of events in the last 20 years of the last century, with the bombings done by the IRA in Manchester and Warrington, both are less than 32 miles from Liverpool, that killed many of our people, including children in that region. And only when you unlearn the lies, because if you don't, it will repeat, and discover true history, will the divisions of the people be healed.